The film, Gladiator, gives you a Commodus who is calculating, coldly intelligent, politically ruthless, and ultimately killed in the arena by a gladiator he had spent the entire movie trying to destroy. It is one of the most compelling screen villains in the history of the historical epic, and it won Joaquin Phoenix an Academy Award nomination for the performance. Every major plot point involving Commodus in that film is fiction. Marcus Aurelius did not plan to restore the Republic before his death. Commodus did not kill his father. There was no gladiator named Maximus seeking revenge. Commodus was not killed in the arena by a man he had wronged. The Republic was not restored after his death. The film's entire narrative architecture, built on the idea of a great emperor's vision betrayed by a monstrous son, who was then brought to justice by a man from the people, is a screenwriter's invention applied to a historical figure who was, in the documented record, considerably stranger and more disturbing than the movie's version in almost every respect. The real Commodus fought as a gladiator 735 times. He used a wooden sword because he was the emperor of Rome and nobody was going to hit him with a real one. His opponents were given wooden weapons too, or lead ones according to some sources, which meant that all 735 bouts were predetermined exhibitions in which the most powerful man in the known world demonstrated his imaginary gladiatorial prowess to audiences who applauded on schedule or faced consequences. According to the historian Cassius Dio, who was a senator and personally witnessed these events, Commodus was paid 1 million sesterces per appearance from the gladiatorial fund, which he then required the Senate to pay back to him from the public treasury. The Senate, watching from their seats, was required to cheer with scripted chants. Cassius Dio recorded watching the spectacle from the senatorial seating and wrote, with the restrained contempt of a senator who had watched his colleagues humiliated into applauding nonsense for years, that this cost him as much pain as though he were cutting off his own limbs. The man who starred in Rome's greatest gladiatorial fiction was, by the documented account of an eyewitness who was there, less impressive than a reasonably athletic teenager with a wooden stick. Lucius Aelius Aurelius Commodus was born on August 31st, 161 AD, in Lanuvium, near Rome. He was the son of the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, whom historians have consistently rated among the finest rulers in Roman history, and of Faustina the Younger. He was the only son of Marcus Aurelius to survive to adulthood, which, in a dynasty that had operated on the principle of adopting the most capable candidate for succession, rather than accepting the hereditary principle, made his existence simultaneously a dynastic relief and a philosophical contradiction. Marcus Aurelius, who had written the Meditations and who governed according to Stoic principles about duty, reason, and the common good, spent considerable effort trying to educate his son in those same principles. He hired some of the finest tutors available in the Roman world. The result, in the surviving accounts, was a young man who showed no interest whatsoever in philosophy, governance, or anything that could be described as preparation for managing an empire of 60 million people across 3 continents. He became co-emperor with his father at age 16 in 107 AD. Marcus Aurelius died in 180 AD during the Danubian campaigns, and Commodus assumed sole power at 19. His first significant act as sole emperor was to negotiate peace with the Germanic tribes his father had been fighting and return to Rome. The ancient sources describe the peace terms as generous to the point of embarrassment, and military historians have debated ever since whether Commodus made a pragmatic decision to stabilize a difficult frontier, or simply wanted to get back to the capital as quickly as possible. Whatever his reasoning, the decision ended the wars. Marcus Aurelius had spent most of his reign prosecuting and freed Commodus to pursue the activities he actually found interesting. Those activities, described with increasing horror across the accounts of Cassius Dio, Herodian, and the Historia Augusta, centered on 2 interconnected obsessions that would define his reign and eventually get him killed. The first was his identification with Hercules. Commodus had himself depicted in statuary and official portraiture, wearing a lion's skin and carrying a club, the standard iconography of Hercules, in Roman artistic tradition. He gave himself the official title Hercules Romanus. He renamed Rome itself Colonia Commodiana, meaning the colony of Commodus. He renamed the months of the year after various names he had given himself: Amazonius, Invictus, Felix, Pius, Lucius, Aelius, Aurelius, Commodus, Augustus, Herculeus, Romanus, ex superatorius. 12 months, 12 names, all referring to one person. The grain fleet that supplied Rome with food was renamed the Commodian fleet. The specific contrast between Marcus Aurelius and Commodus was so dramatic that ancient writers treated it almost as a moral argument about inherited power versus adopted succession. The Nerva Antonine dynasty that preceded Commodus had been built on the principle of adoptive succession, each emperor choosing his successor based on competence rather than biological relationship. Nerva adopted Trajan, who adopted Hadrian, who adopted Antoninus Pius, who adopted Marcus Aurelius, alongside Lucius Verus. The result was roughly a century of relatively stable and capable government that Edward Gibbon, writing in the 18th century, described as the period in which the condition of the human race was most happy and prosperous. Commodus broke that chain by being Marcus Aurelius's biological son. The emperor who had governed by philosophical principle about choosing the best person for the role could not bring himself to set aside his own child, even as the evidence mounted that the child was not suited for the position. The first emperor in generations to pass power to his actual son produced a reign that Cassius Dio described as the descent from a kingdom of gold to one of iron and rust. This irony was not lost on the ancient writers, who used the Commodus case repeatedly as an argument against hereditary succession. It is the backdrop against which the film Gladiator explicitly positions itself. The question of whether Marcus Aurelius should have chosen a successor other than his son. The historical answer is that he probably should have, though the film's specific mechanism, the philosopher-emperor planning to restore the Republic, has no historical support whatsoever. This was not simply vanity in the ordinary Roman tradition of imperial self-promotion, which was itself considerable. It was a systematic attempt to literally rename reality after himself, to replace the existing conceptual framework of Roman identity with one in which Commodus occupied every position simultaneously: citizen, emperor, god, hero, gladiator, the foundation of the city itself. The practical consequences of this for ordinary administration were documented carefully by the ancient sources. While Commodus was engaged in renaming the world after himself, the actual work of governing an empire was delegated to a succession of powerful ministers who used that access to pursue their own interests. Subscribe to Erased from History now, because the arena performances are where this story stops being the portrait of an eccentric and starts being something that a senator sitting in those seats described as torture. Cassius Dio attended what he described as a 14-day continuous spectacle, during which Commodus fought in the arena every day. He describes it as a first-hand witness, writing in the kind of detail that only someone who was actually there could provide. He describes Commodus's appearance in full gladiatorial equipment: the helmet of the secutor type, with its smooth, rounded surface and small eye openings, the rectangular shield, the short sword, the manica on the sword arm. He describes the predetermined nature of the bouts, with attendants positioned to protect the emperor and opponents who, as the historian Herodian put it bluntly, submitted to him only because they knew he was the emperor, not because he was actually a gladiator. The animal hunts were different. When Commodus fought animals, according to both Cassius Dio and Herodian, there was no theatrical arrangement protecting him from actual danger in the same way. He killed animals. Cassius Dio records 5 hippopotami killed in a single session. He records 2 elephants, several rhinoceroses, and a giraffe, dispatched with what Dio describes in a phrase suggesting considerable suppressed fury as the greatest of ease. He was left-handed and proud of it. The sources note that he was an excellent shot with a bow from a moving platform, capable of shooting the heads off ostriches in full gallop and killing a panther as it attacked a victim in the arena. The ostriches deserve particular attention because they produce the single most disturbing anecdote in Cassius Dio's account. After Commodus decapitated several ostriches in the arena with crescent-shaped arrows that cleanly removed the heads from the still-running bodies, he walked toward the senatorial seating section, carrying a severed ostrich head in one hand and his bow in the other, and looked directly at the senators, who understood immediately that they were being shown what he could do to them. Cassius Dio, sitting in that section, wrote that the spectators would have burst out laughing at the absurdity of it had they not been terrified, and that he and his neighbor held laurel branches in front of their mouths and chewed on them to disguise the fact that they were laughing in order to avoid being noticed doing so. This is the scene the film did not give you, not a villain monologuing about power while a hero plots revenge, but a room full of the most powerful men in the Roman world biting on foliage to hide that they were laughing at the emperor, terrified he would notice. The episode with the men who had lost their feet was documented by Cassius Dio and represents one of the more genuinely disturbing recorded uses of the arena as personal theater in the entire historical record. Commodus ordered men from Rome who had lost feet to accident or disease to be brought into the arena. He then had their knees wrapped in cloth, fashioned to resemble serpents' bodies, placed them in position, along with sponges to throw, and proceeded to beat them to death with a club while announcing that he was performing the Labor of Hercules, defeating the giants. Cassius Dio, describing this, uses language that reads, even in translation, as barely contained revulsion. This was not combat or spectacle in any conventional sense, but the systematic killing of disabled civilians, framed as divine mythology by the man who controlled the most powerful military force on earth. It is worth applying the same historiographical honesty here that this channel applies across all its subjects. Cassius Dio and Herodian were senators writing after Commodus was dead, with obvious political motivations to portray him as a monster. The Historia Augusta is notorious for fabrication and embellishment. The hostile bias of the surviving sources is a legitimate methodological concern that historians of the period regularly note. The specific episode with the disabled men appears in Cassius Dio, who was a contemporary eyewitness to many of Commodus's arena appearances. The 14-day continuous gladiatorial spectacle is corroborated across multiple independent sources. The renaming of Rome and the months is documented in official records and coinage, rather than just hostile literary accounts. The broad outline of the behavior that eventually led to the conspiracy against his life is sufficiently attested across enough independent sources that modern historians generally accept the core picture, while treating specific anecdotes with appropriate skepticism about details. The Hercules identification that defined the last years of Commodus's reign produced one of the more peculiar chapters in the official record of any Roman emperor, because it was not merely symbolic or ceremonial, but extended into the physical presentation of official Roman state documents. Coins minted during Commodus's reign show him depicted with the lion skin and club of Hercules. Official decrees were issued under his accumulated titles, which, by the end of his reign, had grown to an unwieldy list of names that modern historians have to abbreviate just to cite. Inscriptions across the empire were modified to reflect the renamed months, meaning that administrative correspondence in far-flung provinces of Britain or Syria was using Commodus's self-referential calendar as a dating system for official documents. The renaming of Rome as Colonia Commodiana was not a casual gesture. It required official proclamations, administrative updates, and the production of new documentation throughout the empire's bureaucratic system. The Senate went along with all of it, which is the detail that makes the parallel with the Cassius Dio account of the arena performances so illuminating. An institution that had been the foundational political body of the Roman world for centuries was formally endorsing the replacement of Rome's name with an emperor's personal honorific, using scripted chants in the arena and official votes in the curia, because the alternative to going along with these demands was considerably worse than the indignity of complying. The financial dimension of Commodus's reign is an aspect that the popular dramatization consistently ignores in favor of the more spectacular personal behavior. But it is important context for understanding why the conspiracy against him eventually formed. His personal expenses, including the gladiatorial payments, the constant public spectacles, and the various renaming projects that required the physical replacement of inscriptions across the empire, were enormous. His administrative neglect, which delegated actual governance to a series of ministers who used the access corruptly, produced an administration that contemporary sources describe as increasingly chaotic. The senator, Cassius Dio, who was navigating this system while simultaneously attending arena spectacles and biting on laurel leaves, was writing from direct experience of what it felt like to be a member of the governing class during a period when the formal structure of governance was being systematically emptied of meaning by an emperor who found the actual work of governing less interesting than fighting staged bouts in the Colosseum. The frustration in his account is that of a man who understood what good government looked like, had lived through periods of it, and was watching the machinery of state being redirected toward one man's entertainment at considerable cost to everyone else. The assassination itself was considerably more chaotic than the film's arena death suggested, and it involved a circle of conspirators that included Commodus's own mistress. According to the sources, the plot in 192 AD was organized by a group that included the Praetorian prefect Latus, the chamberlain Eclectus, and Marcia, who was Commodus's longtime favorite companion. According to the Historia Augusta and Cassius Dio, Marcia attempted to poison Commodus first, mixing a dose into wine she served him. The dose made him sick. He vomited, but it did not kill him. The conspirators, aware that if he recovered and understood what had happened they were all dead, made a different arrangement. They sent a wrestler named Narcissus into the emperor's private apartments, where Commodus was sick and alone, and Narcissus strangled him in his bath. The official announcement the next morning stated that the emperor had died of apoplexy. This is the real ending of the Gladiator emperor, not a noble death in the arena, witnessed by thousands, with a dying man's last words honoring the legacy of his father, but a sick man strangled in a bathtub by a hired athlete while his mistress waited outside to find out if it had worked. Hollywood needed a gladiator's death. What actually happened was considerably less cinematic. What it was instead was the documentation of what actually becomes of a man who spends 12 years replacing reality with his own mythology, who names the world after himself and then discovers that the world, one night, has decided to push back. Commodus's death was not a restoration of justice or of the Republic. The chaos that followed was substantial. The conspirators installed a new emperor who lasted 86 days before being killed by the Praetorian Guard, setting off a period of instability that historians have described as the beginning of the long deterioration of the second-century stability that Marcus Aurelius had represented. The republic that the film promises is restored at the end was never restored. The empire continued through increasingly turbulent succession crises until its eventual collapse. Cassius Dio, who was there, who chewed laurel leaves in the senatorial section to hide his laughter while an emperor held up a severed ostrich head and looked at them, wrote his summary of Commodus with a phrase that has survived in the historical record for 19 centuries. He was a greater curse to the Romans than any pestilence or any crime. The film needed a monster with a plan. The history gives you something stranger, and in its own way, more unsettling. A man who was not executing a coherent strategy of evil, but who had simply decided at some point along the way that the world was an arena built for his personal entertainment, and that everyone in it was a prop. That is the real Gladiator Emperor. If you want the history they don't put in the movies, subscribe to Erased from History, because next week we go somewhere even darker.